The purpose of life support is to help others know how to come alongside those who are hurting and suffering. And hosted by Paul Johnson, Senior Pastor of Ridgewood Church in Minnetonka, Minnesota.
Everything you do from then on is different.
One of the detectives, I think his name was
He was
Derek.
a golden boy.
All we can do right now is come together.
Extreme domestic violence, multiple rapes.
I am so glad you've chosen to join us on Life Support, and this is such a unique opportunity for us to help you find a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ through suffering and trauma. There's pain in our world, and you're either experiencing it or you're interacting with someone who is, no doubt. So I hope that you can be encouraged. I'm talking with my wife, Wendi, this week. A little bit of a departure from what we normally do, but we're just talking about our story and how God has interacted with us. And if you're just catching up with our story, our 21-year-old son, Taylor, was taken from us 7 years ago in a homicide. And there have been all kinds of ripple effects to that, but we have also experienced God's grace. And where we left off last time is we had been through an 8-month kind of waiting period to find out what had actually happened. We knew the place. We didn't know who or how it had happened because the police needed to keep that confidential. But now it was finally time to make arrests. And we got a call on Wednesday morning. And I remember I was at work, and the call that they said would never happen came and said, the driver is not talking. We want you to come down to the precinct. And Mr. Johnson, would you talk to him? And I said, sure. And of course, at this point, I had no idea what I was doing. I was just trying to be an obedient citizen, and I had a lot of Mountain Dew and Holy Spirit and Red Bull in me. And so I got in my car and drove down there, and they ushered me into a room just like you'd see on Law and Order, and there was a kind of a hardened gang type sitting there named Rocky, which, as I look back now, is kind of funny if you want to think of it. But he wasn't going to say a word to me. The detective tried to get him to cooperate, and my job was to ask him, to plead with him, to answer questions, and he just wasn't going to. And so I did my best to tell him about God and share some of the gospel with him, and then we left. And I remember the detective just apologizing right and left, and I'm sorry we wasted your time and so forth. But they were very kind, and so I went home, and later that night, around 10 or so, the phone rang again, and this time it was, can you come down and talk because we have the shooter in custody? And again, being dutiful, when he started to pray, I got in the car, drove down there about 35 minutes, walked in and had to wait. And so I kind of sat around the police precinct, talked to the detectives. They showed us the room that they had been using for the headquarters of the investigation for the last 8 months. I was shocked. There were 35 computer stations. And I said, well, this is for all of your cases. No, he goes, this is for your case. So they had done this massive undercover operation. So we waited and waited, and finally they came down, and one of the detectives said, listen, he is talking. So here's the thing, he wants to say he's sorry. And I remember thinking to myself that there is really no choice for me to go up and talk to him. I did have a choice. The detective had said, you don't have to. But I knew as a Christian and theologically that he had been a sinner just like me, and we're both in the same boat, really. And without Christ, I would be just like him, and Christ is our only hope. And so I knew I needed to go talk to him. And I expected to see another gang member like the first one, but I walked in and really saw a scared 23-year-old kid in his orange jumpsuit sitting in the corner. And he said he was sorry, and he was crying and so forth. And I just remember looking at him and saying, we're going to work on forgiving you. And I said, when we're all done with this process, would you be interested in find out more about how God can change your life? And he said he would. And he got up and he came across the room, and I'll never forget this moment. I remember looking over to the detective and saying, are you going to do something about this? Because this man who's bigger than me is coming toward me without handcuffs on or anything. And he just reached out and gave me this huge bear hug. And so there we stood, hugging each other in the middle of this room. And I went home and told Wendi about this, and we had to go do a press conference was the next big step. And we met with the detective or the sergeant who was in charge of the media, and Wendi, as she always does, prayed. Her name was Jennifer, and that really had an effect on her, I think.
Yeah, I remember she brought us into her office before the press conference and was just kind of giving us the rundown of what it was going to be like to prepare us. And I knew that you were going to be reading a statement and knew that she was going to be talking, and figured my role at that point was support, and so just asked her if I could pray again. And I think all along the way, whether it was with the detectives or whoever was a part of this journey, I know that in some form they were putting themselves out on the line. And not only did we want to pray for their protection, right, but we wanted to pray over them and have them experience what it's like to be prayed over. Because if they've never experienced prayer or been in a church or heard anything about Jesus, I wanted them to experience that in some form. So yeah, it was. I think that came out later in the press conference that we realized the effect that it had.
Well, she broke down and began to cry at one point, and the media was badgering her. Did you know this young man? Why are you crying? And I think it's because she had been with you praying, and she was very touched by that. And she developed a heart for Taylor and a heart for our family. And it was just really strange. Before I became a pastor, I spent a lot of years in the media, and so I'd been on the other side of those cameras before, but it was quite surreal. And we got a note later on that day, I don't know if you remember this, but from one of the newscasters that had been there from one of the Chinese stations in Vancouver, which there's a huge Chinese population. He just said, "Hey, I'm a Christian, and I just want you to know I appreciate what you said." And then, even more bizarre is the family of the man who was arrested, Jesse, his sister reached out to us. And that began a relationship with his family that carried on until we reached the courts. And so to speed ahead and to make a long story short, we got through the press conference, and then became the legal part of it became the focus then for us.
Do you remember on our drive home from the press conference, we turned the radio on, and we were hearing ourselves on the radio, and the radio, you know the term, I don't know the term, but
they call them hosts, I believe.
Okay, the host was saying something like, "Call in and tell us what you think about this family that is going to forgive the person."
Yeah, the
who
question
took
of
their
the day
son's
was,
life.
would you forgive the man who killed your son?
Yeah, like I just sat
because
there
that
and
was a
went,
big thing of our talk was we want to forgive this kid because
Right.
Christ has forgiven us.
Right, and I think that was even the heart of our adult children as well at the time. All of us right away, we were still in pain, but the whole point was, okay, well, we're going to pray whoever took Taylor's life to Jesus. We're going to pray that they can encounter Christ and turn their life around.
I remember one of our daughters, I'll never forget this, she looked at us and said, "There's no reason that two young men should lose their lives in this."
Yep.
And so that's kind of the tact we took. And it wasn't that we were being naive or were happy or not angry or frustrated, but again, as believers, we know that we are sinful. We know that we are at odds with God. We cannot have eternal life on our own, and we all need to be forgiven. And so who are we to withhold forgiveness from someone else? And we began to work through this laborious legal system, and it took a long time. We had waited 8 months, and it was another long period of time before there was any kind of trial. Thankfully, the man's name was Jesse. Jesse pleaded guilty, although they pled him down to manslaughter, which was frustrating for us because, that didn't seem like a fair charge considering what we lost, but we just tried to leave that in the hands of God. And we inherited a prosecutor who was, would have made Law and Order seem tame. He was a veteran. He was good at what he did, but I'm glad I was on his side because he was pretty gruff. but you kept praying for him too, which had a huge impact on him. And he didn't really know what to make of that. I remember at this, and so we finally came to the courthouse the day that we were going to do the sentencing, and we had the opportunity to read our victim impact statements to the judge, and it was really an emotional day. Jesse's family was there. Mm-hmm. I remember his dad came out and gave me a huge hug and said he was sorry this had all happened, and my heart really went out to Jesse's family because they were hurting too through all of this. And really, Wendi, I think that's when you really began. That was the first time you even saw Jesse. Mm-hmm. And then you had an opportunity to extend your own hand of forgiveness to him.
Yeah, it was. I remember thinking through the fact that you had seen Jesse. You had been in the same room with him. But I was so worried about seeing him for the first time. And so when we got to that courtroom, he was in an orange suit and he's behind the desk thing with the glass, and we're in the court there, and we're reading our victim impact statements, and we're reading our statements on behalf of our children as well, who weren't going to be there. That would have been too traumatizing for them. We were learning new things even that day that we had to process that were really hard. And Jesse, I remember getting up, and he read an apology letter to our family. And I just remember watching his demeanor, and, he came from a hard life, and he had a goal to, work his way up in the gang, and that was going to be his mode of employment and his dream kind of. And just remember watching him, and I remember as he was reading this statement or this apology letter, he started to cry, and there were a box of Kleenex right in front of him, and instead of grabbing a Kleenex, he took a shirt and he grabbed it and pulled it up over his face and wiped his face. And I was just taking it all in. So as we left, the judge asked us to all take a recess, and we went out to the lobby, and I just broke down in tears, and I wasn't prepared for that because I was in business mode, and I've had to be in business mode before, and I just wasn't prepared for all of this, and I was trying to figure out what was going on in my head and my heart. And what I was remembering is this video that you and Adina and Jeremy and Taylor had made for me and Mackenzie before we were blending our family. And
Wendi had been abandoned by her husband. I had lost my first wife to cancer, so we were already this kind of crazy blended group.
Yeah, and God put us together. But I remember you made this video for us. And when Taylor went into the screenshot, he was 11 years old. And in his eyes, I saw, I need you. I need love. Will you help me? And so in that courtroom, I was seeing the same thing in Jesse's eyes, and it was kind of freaking me out. And I broke down, and I went to our attorney and just said, I know this may sound crazy, but is there any way I can react to his, I want to be able to say something to him. He's written us this letter. I want to be able to respond. Can I respond, and can I hug him? And he threw his hands up in the air and was like, who are these people? And he said, I'll go find out from the judge. And I hadn't even talked to you about it, but I just really felt like the Holy Spirit was just like really prodding me. And so was talking with you, you said absolutely fine. And then he goes and he talks to the judge, and he comes back and he says, okay, so after the judge reads the sentence, then he will call you forward, and you'll be able to respond to Jesse's letter, but you can't hug him. He has to stay behind the glass. And I said, okay. And so I just remember us, waiting and hearing that sentencing. And then he invited me up, and I just know that I thanked the family, first of all. I thanked Jesse's family because they could have chosen to read their victim impact statements at that time too, but they chose not to. And I felt like that was God's graciousness to us, because that would have been really hard to take that day. So that, and then I also thanked Jesse for writing that letter, and just was really letting him know that we are, as a family, are praying for him, that this is going to be an opportunity while in prison to turn his life around and really see that these gangs are leading to death. They're not leading to life, but Christ can lead to life. And so was just thankful to have that opportunity.
Yeah, that was an amazing day, and the police officers were very gracious again. And I remember one of them saying, "Could I exchange Christmas cards with you?" And I said, "Yes, that would be fine." I think that was his way of saying, I want to be friends.
Mm-hmm.
So we had an opportunity before we moved back here to Minnesota 3.5 years ago or so to visit Jesse. We had an opportunity to spend almost a whole day with him, to share the gospel with him. God has given us opportunities through a program in the province of British Columbia that allows us to communicate with him. The man who was running that program, little known by the BC government, was a former pastor who understood exactly what we were trying to do. So we have that opportunity. But this is something that's really never gone away, and it's going to keep, in a way, it's the gift that keeps on giving. We found out through the government of British Columbia this past couple of weeks ago that he was beginning the possibility of parole already, and they were starting to move through that process. So you have to kind of revisit your forgiveness and justice, and realize that God is a God of justice. But our children are still suffering, and I think that's what makes it the most difficult. And before this happened, we were a fairly normal family, although we had been through some trauma already. This really put a couple of our kids over the edge, and that makes this, an ongoing thing. So what I'm going to do here in the last couple of minutes is first I'm going to say what I've learned through this, and I'll let you do the same. What I've learned about people who are going through trauma is that they are only really interested in people caring. They don't necessarily want everybody to try to make them feel better. They just want to know that you're there for them. They get overwhelmed very quickly. And when you have someone in your church or a friend or a family member, you need to just be there with your presence and ask them what they need. And if they say they don't need anything, then you just need to respect that. I've also learned that God has been working in this situation the whole time. And I mean, you and I have had a chance to speak in prisons. We've had a chance. You've had a chance to speak to women's groups, all opened up because of the opportunity to interact with the man who shot Taylor in our situation there. And I've also seen God work in the hearts of people, and I've learned much more about Christ. I've learned much more that He is there. He never forsakes us. And I think it's deepened my love for Him, and it's also deepened my empathy for others and given me skills to navigate through trauma with people that I wouldn't have had before.
I think, too, for me, it's just when I look back and think of the people that really ministered to me in that time, it was people, like you said, that spent time with me and were present. They wept with me. They mourned with me. They didn't sit there and try to fix it. They didn't try to Christianese it away. They just sat with me in my pain.
Which is the hardest thing to do. And those are the people, sometimes aren't the people that you're expecting.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they show themselves to be the most mature.
Yeah, and then I think I've also learned to, we hear a lot, think before you speak, but when someone's in trauma, it's super important to do that, because there are a lot of well-meaning people out there that just want to offer something to you, but sometimes they say things that can be really hurtful. And for me, I had been Taylor's stepmom for 10 years, but I didn't view myself as a stepmom. I viewed myself as that Taylor was hand-chosen for me, and I was hand-chosen for him after Jody had passed away. And so when someone would ask about how you were doing or the kids were doing, they would be so concerned, and then they would just say, well, you were just his stepmom. And so I just have a real heart for people that are walking through this journey, that are or navigating that side of it. So part of it is saying to myself, they're a well-meaning person. They do love me. They just misstepped here with a few words, you know what I mean? And not holding on to it so it's hurting my heart. But
well, we've certainly learned a lot,
Yeah.
and we have a lot more to learn, and our story is not over. There's still very difficult spots in it, and we know there'll be more difficult spots in it, but we do have the hope of eternal life. We know that Taylor was a believer. He's with Christ, and we know that, and we also know that God isn't going to, forsake us. But trauma is real, and the other thing I would just say is that just because people in your church or in your friend group or at work look like they're doing okay does not mean they're doing okay. I've talked to a lot of people on this show that have lost people through suicide and other ways who looked like they were doing okay. So don't be afraid to ask, to just nose in a little bit, get involved, get to know them, and develop relationships with them, and because people are not going to just come out and tell you that they're dying inside, but they look like they're doing just fine, and we're really good at that in churches. We are good mask people.
Yes, we are.
So, well, Wendi, it's been good to have you, and our story isn't so unusual. Maybe the motif of it is, but many of you have been through trauma as well. In Genesis, we read that Joseph was introduced to tremendous suffering. He was abandoned by his brothers, forgotten in prison, and yet he realized that God was at work the whole time, and that's what Wendi and I have realized as well. In Genesis 50:20, he looked at his brothers who had come back, and he said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And so though your trauma or suffering may feel like an overwhelming fog or a deep weight on you, remember that God intends it for good, that it will maybe not take your pain away, but that may help you keep your spiritual balance. So I'm so thankful for this amazing promise of God. If you'd like to check out Ridgewood Church, you can log on to myrwc.org/life support, and we'd love to talk with you. I would mention, too, that if you're struggling in your own life, if you're struggling in trauma, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline is available to you at 1-800-273-8255. Join me on Twitter at Pastor Paul J. We share all kinds of interesting things there, and we do deal with trauma. So glad you listened to Life Support, and we'll see you next time.